Doubtless a major contributor to the development of IFRS 15 was concerns about how revenues were being allocated across transactions where there were packages of goods and services being sold. This is not an issue if you have the goods or services being sold with a common performance obligation, because in these situations the revenue is going to be recognized on a consistent basis, so therefore how you allocate the revenue across the different items is not going to be an issue. And in fact, if you have a look more closely at the standard, you'll see that it actually says that when you have a common performance obligation, it is appropriate to aggregate multiple contracts and to account for them as a single transaction. Where the problems arise is when you have goods or services being provided which have different obligations. And this is an issue because if you have different performance obligations, then it suggests that the revenue is going to be recognized at different times. And the consequence of this is that it's going to have a significant impact on when revenues are recognized in total. So this is a much more complex problem. And the approach that's taken with the standard here is that you have to have an allocation of revenues across the goods and services being sold. And probably the best way of demonstrating this is with a simple example, such as the purchase of a mobile phone with a service contract attached to it. It's probably what transaction we're most familiar with. So here we have Telstra, which sells a good, a Samsung mobile phone, with a 1-year capped service contract. So it's good and a service. And the total revenue on the transaction is $2,000, which is payable in advance. Now, if this was the equivalent of the standalone prices for the goods for the phone and the service, you'd simply allocate on the basis of the standalone prices. However, in this particular case, the standalone price for the phone is $500. The standalone price for the service contract is $2,000, $2,500 in total. So the total revenue is less than the standalone price for the combined products. So we have to have some basis for allocating it. The way we do this is on the basis of the relative value of standalone prices. Now the phone contributes $500 of the $2,500 standalone price. That's 20%. So we allocate 20% of the revenues to the phone. So 20% of $2,000 is $400. And we allocate $2,000 out of $2,500, or 80% of the revenues of $2,000 to the service. That's $1,600. So what we've done here is that we have allocated the revenues across the two goods and service items, and we've done it on the basis of their relative selling prices. To simplify things in this question, I've ignored any time value of money. So when we enter into the contract, we'd receive $2,000, or Telstra would receive $2,000. To the extent that $400 of that relates to the phone, which is with the performance obligation is met on the day where the contract is entered into, the phone's handed over, you'd recognise that immediately as revenue. And the service revenue, which relates to services provided over the next year, well, the service hasn't been provided yet, so the performance obligation isn't met, and so you'd recognise unearned revenue at the date you entered into the contract. And this sort of highlights why it's important that we allocate the revenue across the two different goods and services, but it also provides insights into how we allocate it is going to determine when we recognise revenue in aggregate. So that's a problem. Of that $1,600 in unearned revenue, what we'd do is we'd recognise $133 per month of revenue, and that would gradually diminish the unearned revenue from $1,600 down to zero. The $133 per month is simply the $1,600 worth of unearned revenue divided by 12. So that just demonstrates how we allocate revenues across multiple goods and services.